Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and in this one I'm going to go over my round 7 game from the 2019 Marshall Championship. Now, if you followed the round 6 video, you know that I won a pretty nice game against Grandmaster Leonid Udasin, and I finally was back on 50%. And to be honest, going in with 3 rounds to go, I actually was somewhat thinking about GM Norm. Obviously, it was very irrational to think about this with so many rounds to go, but I actually knew even before my game against Udasin that if I won 4 games in a row, plus 3 was actually enough to get the norm. And so before the game with Udasin, I was on -1, and I was just thinking, well, let me just win the first game. And then I beat Udasin. I was like, all right, well, let me win this game. And that was kind of my thought process was, well, if I take it one game at a time, I might give myself that chance. But important to think about, or important to know that I was thinking about that because it actually did play a little bit of a role later in the game. Anyways, I was white here against Grandmaster Oliver Barbosa, a player who's originally from the Philippines but has been living in New York for quite some time, and I think him and Mark Paragua actually know each other very well. I played him obviously earlier in the tournament, and they're always hanging out together. I think they're old friends. Both moved to the U.S., started families here and so on. So very nice guy and always a tough opponent as well. So without further ado, let me get into it. So I opened with D4, and Oliver played D5, and after C4, E6 was played. And so typically this kind of signals Queen's Gambit decline territory, but you never know what variation you're really going to see. And so I now went for Knight C3, and, there's Bishop E7, that's a move. He can even switch to the triangle variation with C6. But Oliver played the move Knight F6, and I did done some work, particularly on the black side of the Queen's Gambit exchange variation, so I thought, well, why don't I give it a go with white since I know the plan so well? So I went for C takes D5, and after E takes D5, I played the move Bishop G5, and Bishop G5 really does signal this the Queen's Gambit exchange variation in many ways because you pin this knight, and the contours of the pawn structure are set, where white has a king side pawn majority, but black has a queen side pawn majority, and it's a very, very fascinating structure that's gone back decades. And if you follow this channel, you know that I've played quite a bit in this type of position as well, but mainly with black. Here, actually, Barbosa actually surprised me with a move that I really don't think is completely accurate, but has gotten a lot of play in the last few years, and it's actually the move Bishop B4. And Bishop B4 is certainly unique. Typically in these structures, you just play the bishop to E7, or, as I've demonstrated in some games, to play it to D6. And the idea is that you're a little bit nearer to your king with bishop E7. You're just kind of nullifying that pin right away. My idea with bishop D6 is more aggressive, but obviously I don't play it right away. I actually start with the move C6, and then I go bishop D6, just so the D5 pawn is protected. But essentially, the idea with Bishop B4 is way more aggressive, and the point is that in a lot of lines, black is trying to manufacture pressure on the C3 knight and this pin before white can truly castle and get the king safe. And this is, again, very aggressive. I think I tried this once, maybe I want to say 5 years ago or 6 years ago. There was when I was actually preparing for the Danish Championship, I had a look at positions like this when I played, and it was a very, very interesting look, but I settled on it being a little bit too risky. But in recent years, I think Daniil Dubov has tried this quite a bit. And so, I was really curious what the idea was, and I'd known that there was some lines with H6 and G5. So anyways, I played E3, which is normal, and I think the thing that you have to notice about this position is it's actually very, very similar to another type of position known as the Queen's Gambit declined Ragozin variation. And the point in that system is after knight F3, this is actually the starting position of the Ragozin, where white seems to have a really annoying pin on the knight here, but in a lot of the lines, black does go H6, G5, and then knight E4, and creates really aggressive play on his own. And I simply think that the position that I got after e3 should be a better version of the Rogozin, because in the Queen's Gambit exchange variation, I can play bishop d3 and then put the knight on e2. And in that way, I don't have to worry about, spoiling my pawn structure in some way or even losing a pawn, because I can reinforce the knight on c3 with the knight on e2. But I wasn't quite sure if I'd have time for all of this, because I obviously want to go bishop d3 before going knight e2 so as to be able to develop all my pieces in castle. And so I think here, if black plays a really, robotic move like castles, now I'm going to play bishop d3 and get everything I want. And if h6, bishop h4, g5 here, I go back to g3, and I think knight e4 isn't going to really fit the bill, because I can just go knight e2 and cover my knight, and I'm not too concerned about losing my g3 bishop, because after hg I'd have a lot of counterplay on the h-file and some light squares that may potentially be weak because of this g5 thrust. Unfortunately for me, Oliver actually played h6 right away, and this is just way more accurate. And I think this is really the test of the variation, is what to do with the bishop right away, because now if I go bishop h4, well, I think g5 is in the cards, and after bishop g3, knight e4, you have a very sharp position on the board where this pin is present. And if I try to nullify that by going rook c1, now black has the move h5. And the point is that black is just trying to hunt down the bishop on g3, and it's very, very unclear position, because you don't want to make a move like h4 trying to free your bishop, because that'd be very bad on account of knight takes g3, f takes g3, and the structure is just totally awful, and all the dark squares are just too weak in the white camp. So you don't want to go h4, but then at the same time you go f3 and after h5, and well, even here your structure is not as bad as if you played f takes g3, but it's still not ideal. And well, it's a complicated game where black also does maintain the bishop pair. So these were some of the things I was wrestling with, and I just thought that if Barbosa was really prepared to go in for a sharp line like this, it might be a little bit risky for me to go for it. So I instead played the move bishop takes f6, which I figured was a little bit more of a positional treatment. And after queen takes f6, I played the move a3. A3 is not particularly accurate, but the idea was that I wanted to just get the bishop back right away, and I was willing to kind of lose time to do it because I thought my pawn structure was relatively compact in the center. And so I thought that this capture on c3 wouldn't trouble me too much. If I really did want the bishop back right away, just to sort of nullify the advantage of the bishop pair, I should have instead gone queen b3. The point here is that I'm attacking the d5 pawn and the b4 bishop, and after the normal queen d6, I can now play a3, and basically black is obliged to actually capture on c3, and then I can take with the queen, which is a little bit more solid than taking with the b pawn towards the center, believe it or not, because a lot of times the c pawn can actually be a weak backward pawn, as we'll see a little bit later in the game. Note that if you go bishop a5, that actually loses a pawn, strangely enough, to queen b5 check, because you have to defend this bishop by going knight c6, and after knight c6 I can go b4. And now that there's no pin on c3, after the bishop moves away, I can actually take on d5. And, this pawn is actually, a very, very important pawn, because it was the only coverage in the center that, black actually had. So white's actually in a serious, white has a serious advantage here, and black's in serious trouble. So because of that, this way would have been a little bit more precise to actually get the bishops. But honestly, I'm not even convinced here that, white really has very much. I mean, if black castles, black is quite solid here. There still is the Carlsbad structure, and I have not made any weaknesses, but again, black should be pretty okay if he goes c6, bishop f5, or bishop e6, depending on the circumstance. And then in the dream scenario, in the Carlsbad, you want to get this knight to d6, because once the knight is on the d6 square, it both prevents the b4, b5 minority attack break. It also covers the c4 square in some lines, and it has the opportunity to control e4 and shift towards the king side. So whenever you see these Carlsbad positions that arise, you want to imagine your knight getting to d6, and you're actually totally fine and can even sometimes be better. So I'm not totally convinced, but this is a little bit more accurate way to play. Anyways, instead, after a3, bishop takes c3 is played, and after b takes e3, black castled. And really the issue here is that, I still have this nice compact pawn structure, and I like that. I also like that I have a light squared bishop that can sit behind my pawns on dark squares. But the thing is, here I'm behind in development, and so I really have to kind of hustle to catch up. And white can really get into some trouble by just kind of playing a little bit mechanically here. And I think I had the potential to get into trouble, because after my move knight f3, black went c5, which is very, very accurate. And all of a sudden here, this c3 pawn is really not so hot. I was thinking in some positions I would liberate with c4, but I'm really just not ready for this at the moment because I'm so underdeveloped. And the issue is here that this pawn tension is actually quite decent for black, and he can try to eventually build up pressure on the c-file by getting a rook to c8. And so that's kind of an annoying thing I have to deal with. And then the other thing that this does is it always gives black the opportunity to actually play c4 with tempo and really unbalance the game if I put a bishop on d3, because you have a scenario with c4 where it could truly become quite a bit of a race, where there's a pawn storm that might happen on the queen side, and I might try to have to get some attack going on the king side. So, yeah, I think already here black is completely fine, and I just got to keep developing. So I went now, unfortunately, for the move knight e5, trying to actually kind of nullify the pressure on this diagonal, and I thought in some lines it might be desirable to actually trade the knights. But instead, I really should have just gone bishop e2. This would have been a lot more sensible, getting closer to castling. I think in a lot of lines, too, I was concerned about knight c6 and knight a5, and just kind of, again, pressuring down the c-file. But yeah, this position is something that would be a little bit more playable for me. Instead, after knight e5, I'm losing valuable time just from the standpoint that development should be the priority, and I'm still not castled. And here I got a little bit of a break because Barbosa did not take advantage of it in the best way. Probably the most attractive move is the move knight c6. And the point is, I really would be taking serious risk continuing to justify my knight in the center with f4. It's probably just a bad idea. And so instead, I would need to take on c6. But the issue is that after knight takes c6, b takes c6, all of a sudden this d5 pawn that I was kind of counting on potentially being an isolani is now really well supported by the other pawn on c6. And because I haven't castled yet, black also is going to be first to the b file, to the one open file in the game. So if I go bishop d3 now, c4, bishop c2, and rook b8, all of a sudden it's black that has a pretty clear space advantage and development advantage from the standpoint that black is going to be the one that connects their rooks first after this bishop gets out the way, probably to f5. And so, yeah, and then in the end games, if this bishop is traded, like for the one on c2 or the one on c8, you can have a scenario where this rook comes down to b3 with really decisive effect. And, yeah, I'd have some problems. So knight c6 was definitely a much better way to kind of press the slight advantage that black had and to sort of take advantage of my lack of development. Instead, knight d7 was played, and this actually is a far more favorable exchange for me because now after knight takes d7, bishop takes d7, I still have the d5 pawn as a potential target for me to work with, and quite frankly, the bishop is not actually so great on d7, so it's going to have to move again. And so I'm pretty much gaining a little bit of time to keep my position going. I now played bishop e2, and bishop e2 seemed a little bit safe to me and more reliable than bishop d3 because I thought that my bishop would be well served on f3, just eyeing this diagonal, eyeing the d5 pawn. Again, I am kind of keen on playing against the d5 pawn that doesn't have any support by any of the other black pawns. So that was kind of my concept. The computer actually prefers bishop d3, and I understand why this is a consideration, because on this diagonal, I'm actually pointing towards the king, and in some situations, it's actually quite useful to not allow the bishop to f5, because on that diagonal, I'm prevented from seizing control of the b1 square. So, makes some sense. But anyways, I did go bishop e2, and black now went rook a c8. And rook a c8, honestly, is a very, very good move. Just kind of eyeing the c-file, trying to play against this backward pawn, potentially. I always have to worry about it. Now, the one good thing is that if c takes d4 ever happens, I will go c takes d4, and I have no backward pawn and, quite a decent structure. But the prospect of the rook invading on the c-file is something I always have to be a little bit concerned about, so I have to be alert. It turns out, though, that a much stronger move would have actually been the move b5. And I think this really kind of highlights how the c3 pawn is quite backward, because not only does it potentially initiate a pawn storm with c4 and a5, it also just continues to point out that I'm not going to get a chance to play c4 anymore because of the domination on that square. So, taking that space is actually very, very effective. And it's actually one of these situations where, the color complex is actually less important than the space. And what I mean by that is you can see black seems to be putting their pawns on light squares, and I seem to have my pawns on dark squares. And so in theory, you might say in endgames, this will be attractive for white because the pawns will be targets. But before the endgame, in the opening and the middle game, the space is actually a more important factor because there are other pieces on the board. And so that space advantage is something I constantly have to give some attention to. So, anyways, that's why b5 would be effective. But instead, rook a c8 was played. And now I finally castled. So it took a little bit of time. And castles on move 14 is not ideal, but it happened, and I was glad to get my king tucked away with what I considered to be a pretty decent structure. Anyways, now bishop f5 was played. I did mention that bishop would relocate, and this is the right diagonal for it. And now I played the move bishop f3, which was my intent all along, to eye the d5 pawn. And now rook f d8 was played, just defending it. Makes a lot of sense. And now I played queen b3. So finally, I'm connecting my rooks as well. I'm potentially pressuring this pawn on b7. And I felt pretty decent about my position here from the standpoint that in the long term, I might be able to kind of execute some type of a4, a5 type of break, maybe target the b7 pawn as a weakness, and get some play going on the b file. The one sort of thing that was annoying to me is that this bishop, again, controlling b1 makes it very difficult to kind of efficiently double on the b file. I'd probably have to go like rook a2, rook b2. And the other thing that I have to be a little bit worried about is with my queen now being dragged away towards the queen side, it seems a little bit far-fetched, but there are a lot of lines where, this h-pawn, almost AlphaZero style, will shove itself up the board, sometimes even accompanied by the g-pawn, and black can begin to engineer a kingside attack. And so even though that is quite risky, given, the tension in the center, obviously if the pawns are pushed up the board and the center blows up, it's probably a bad idea for black. But it is something I have to be a little bit aware of. And so that was something I was already thinking about was, if black elects to play c4 and closes the center, some of these pawn storms can be a little dangerous. So, anyways, after queen b3, rook c7 was played, defending the pawn on b7. And I thought this move was a little bit suspicious. It turns out to be okay, but I thought it was a little bit weird because now the rooks are split. And typically split rooks are not ideal. But I understand why you don't want to play a move like b6, because now I'm going to play a4 and, again, try to hammer away at the weak b6 pawn, and then maybe even get an open a file for counterplay. And again, heading into to the end game, my structure here would be quite decent because the d5 pawn is a constant liability. So, after rook c7, I did have to recognize here that bishop takes d5 didn't really make a whole lot of sense. I went for the move d takes c5, but the point is that if I go bishop takes d5, I believe there was a tactic here. I'm trying to remember what it was. I want to say it was c4. there was some tactic here that that sort of broke the connection between rook and bishop. I'm not sure it's this though, because now I don't see any way that that I'm losing material here. But bishop takes d5 did not work, and I was trying to. I did have a very concrete reason why it didn't work, but it's escaping me at the moment, so I apologize for that. But this didn't work, and so because it didn't work, instead I opted for the move d takes c5. And basically the concept here was that at least now I'm ruining my structure a little bit, because now c3 is weak and going to be isolated, but I'm fixing the d5 pawn as a weakness, and I thought that gave me, really decent chances and a risk-free position to play against, because the d5 pawn is sensitive. So after d takes c5, rook takes c5, I went queen takes b7 and went for that pawn. Part of the reason is because c3 is just now going to be very sensitive, and I thought, well, it would be nice if I can somehow round up a7, swing back over to d4, and then have an outside a pawn to work with, while also playing against an Isolani. And I think Barbosa realized what I was trying to do, because he played the move rook d7 here, which I think is really precise. And it looks a little bit unusual because you allow me to potentially check you on the back rank. But I think it's really accurate to try and hold on to this pawn, because if you don't hold on to that pawn, the a1 will be a runner. So after rook d7, I played the move queen b8 check, at least trying to displace the black king a little bit. And after king h7, I played the move rook a d1. And I think really my dream scenario here was to try and get to some ideal 4 versus 3, where somehow I win the d5 and a7 pawns, and I get to keep one of... and then basically he manages to get the a3 and c3 pawns, but I have a 4 versus 3 on the king side with some pieces on the board and some decent chances, because I am at the moment a pawn up. But after rook a d1, rook takes c3 was played, and the thing that is quite clear to me, and I realize, is that if I just take on d5, well, then after rook takes, bishop takes, rook takes a3, we just have an equal position where I'm really not better at all. Black can play rook a1 and get the rooks off the board as well, and it's just not a position where I can really seriously entertain winning chances. And as I alluded to at the beginning of the video, I actually was still thinking about GM norm, because I did know that if I won my last 3 rounds in a row, that I could get it. So I didn't want to just have the game peter out. I wanted to keep more life in the position. And this definitely impacted my decision making in a negative way. So definitely, I think in the future, I just got to play every game as it is, especially if there are many rounds to go, and not be as reckless, because I pushed the envelope a little bit too much here. Now, my next move isn't bad or anything, but again, to not go for like a clearly pretty decent playable line is not really the best thing to do. And so I now went bishop takes d5, and my whole idea was that after rook takes a3, I played the move queen f4, and my whole idea here was to try and keep pieces on the board to keep life in the position. And there are some threats here. I mean, I am generating some threats. So with the rook split, there is a little bit of a liability there. And if I could move again, I would love to play bishop e4. Point being that if bishop takes e4, then the d7 rook is hanging. So just to illustrate, if black plays a nothing move like a5, now bishop e4 is pretty effective, because if you go rook takes d1, I have bishop takes f5 check. And, black can play g6, but after bishop takes g6 check, queen takes g6, and rook takes d1, now this is much closer to a win than to a draw. I actually think this would be winning, because having a 4 versus 2 and rook endgame would be winning, even if they have an a pawn, because if I get my rook behind the pawn, I can make 2 connected pass pawns on the king side. So this is the type of thing you don't want to allow happen. And this would be a very tough situation to be in, because if you play bishop takes e4, then I have rook takes d7. And actually, more accurate probably might be to play queen takes f6 first, and then after g takes f6, go rook takes d1. And if they go rook takes d1 here, trying to go for some back rank mates somehow, I could just move my queen with like queen b2, And after this, I think white is just winning because there's no real, there aren't any checks that are going to trouble me. My king is safe. So basically, that was kind of my threat, and I thought that, it might be not so easy to deal with these things under some pressure. But the one issue with this type of setup was that I essentially was consuming oodles and noodles worth of time trying to kind of justify, my play. So I was really trying to come up with moves that would challenge my opponent, but I was challenging my situation on the clock, and that was another thing that was not so great about this kind of keep the game going at all costs decision making. So anyways, after queen f4, black played the move queen g6, which is a good move, dealing with this bishop e4 threat. Now if I go bishop e4, that'd be a major blunder because there's bishop takes e4, and after rook takes d7, there's just mate on g2, so I can't go for this trick anymore. And so instead, I now played the move bishop f3. And this was actually a really alert move, I thought, because the other threat in the position is if I play a kind of a lazy move, let's say like rook d4, all of a sudden there's rook takes d5, and I could not believe my eyes. But the point is, after rook takes bishop e4, there's still this mate threat, and my bishop is hanging. So Barbosa's a little sneaky fella. I mean, essentially, coming up with this idea, while defending, still keeping some dynamics in the position where I can go wrong, I think is, very, very, the sign of a very tricky player, actually. So I win bishop f3. Tuck my bishop back so those exchange sacrifices weren't possible. And now black played the move queen e6, which is very accurate move. The point being that really the queen didn't belong on g6 on that diagonal there. Really the bishop wants to go back to g6 if anything, because the bishop is protecting the king on this diagonal. Obviously the queen is not a great protector of any piece because it's the most valuable piece. And so it makes a lot of sense to put the queen on e6. The other thing is if black took on d1 right away, after rook takes d1, I'm the one that has the open file, and this could be a little bit annoying to contend with. So I think queen e6 is a very good move. After queen e6, I still wanted to keep the tension on the d file and kind of force decisions from black, and I do have a weak back rank. So I actually played the move h4, and after the game, Barbosa really complimented me on this move because he thought it was really strong. I'm basically giving my king an escape square. I'm also sometimes thinking about playing h5, which can kind of squeeze the black king kind of into a box where they don't have mobility upwards. And if I check on this diagonal, you never really want to block with the move g6 if I have the pawn on h5, because then I open up the whole 7th rank. So h4 is actually a really, really nice move, and a move that really keeps the pressure going. But again, I think I just invested way too much time with this sequence. Now rook e7 was played. Again, another actually really, really accurate move defending. It does seize the file, but what it does is it tries to threaten the trade of queens. So if I want to go rook d6, now after queen e5, my queen doesn't really have any way to avoid that trade. And if the queens come off the board, I don't really have any dynamic chances here. And I do have to worry about this a-pawn, which could potentially be a runner. But honestly, this position would likely end in a draw. So the fact that he was threatening the queen trade really annoyed me because I wanted to keep the pressure on. And so I played the move h5. I'm still envisioning, somehow taking advantage of this king being a little bit weaker on h7 and doing something with this diagonal one day. Black now went bishop e4, though, which is, again, the other point of going rook e7 is that he could try to exchange the bishops, and that also can potentially get him closer to the draw. And so I think that was a very, very smart decision. And here, I kind of self-destructed. I was very, very keen, again, on winning this game, and it really impacted my decision-making. And, really I should just take on e4. After bishop takes e4, queen takes e4, we trade the queens. I play rook d7, and this endgame is never going to be worse for me. Black can play rook h4, and we could trade some pawns. And, I might even have some chances if I go like rook d1, I don't know, a5, g3. I have to give myself an escape square because rook a1 was mate. And yeah, this position is still about equal, but black still has some defensive tasks to deal with because it might be a little bit annoying to actually defend on the 7th rank here. But the game should end in a draw. Instead, I was still kind of keen on, how do I win? How do I keep pieces on the board? And here I played the move rook d8 and thought I really was on to something here because I calculated something that looked really promising and looked like a win. And I just made a really, really remarkably gross oversight. Now, I was in a bit of time trouble, but it was still very irresponsible to go this way because if it doesn't work out, it really doesn't work out, and I hadn't really worked out all the details properly. And you're going to see what I mean in a moment, because my deal with rook d8 was to play queen b8, and you can see now with this pawn on h5, there's mating threats. But the problem is that after bishop takes f3, for some reason I decided not to recapture on f3, and instead thought, hey, don't I have this mating idea with queen b8? And unfortunately, it just doesn't work because, what I failed to recognize is that the pawn on h5 is just hanging. So after bishop takes h5, this king can actually step out to g6 completely unscathed. Now, when you make a big blunder like this at the board, it's just like a cold shower runs through you. You're just totally shocked, disgusted with yourself, but you're like, how did I miss this? Because I played what I was thinking a risk-free position, and then all of a sudden I blundered while I was pushing the envelope, and it was just a terrible, terrible position. And so, typically if I see that I'm close to losing or I'm going to lose, you prepare yourself so that, when it actually happens, it's not the end of the world. You're ready to extend your hand and resign. Here is very different because I didn't expect this scenario to happen at all. And so I actually played a few more moves in this completely lost position down a piece just because I hadn't fully come to terms with what I did. And so the rest doesn't really deserve too much commentary, but I'm going to show you anyway. So I played rook h8 check. What else? Just to at least get the king out. But after king g6, the king is completely safe. Sadly, I only have 2 checks, and both of them can be blocked quite easily. I opted for queen g3 check. But now after bishop g4, I can't even entertain pinning the queen or pinning the bishop with f3 because then there's queen takes e3 check and I lose a second pawn. And, black is happy to just trade material here because let's say I go king h1. I mean, the position here, even after a move like f5, I still can't even take the bishop yet. And even if I could trade if black would be happy to trade the queens and remain 2 pawns up. So it's just a total nightmare. Instead, after bishop g4, I went rook d1, trying to get cute with rook d6 and taking advantage of this pin. And there are many ways to hold the fort down, but Barbosa played rook d7, which gets the job done. And I declined to trade the rooks, but you can see now I just lost a tempo, and the rook is more active on d7 than it was on e7. So now rook a d3 is played, just trying to trade pieces, and the reality is completely set in. So I went king h2, trying to avoid that trade, and now rook 7 d5 was played, and this move actually threatens rook h5, check. There's also rook d1 in conjunction, then rook h5, and there's also even rook g5, just trying to nullify this pin. And so after the move rook 7 d5, I resigned. Very disappointing game. Again, there was no reason I should lose this game, and I think it kind of ties back to the theme I discussed in the previous round of this tournament, particularly I think after my loss against Paragua, where it just is it's just demonstrating that I can self-destruct, and I need to stop doing that, because when you self-destruct, you get yourself into trouble, and you really don't get into the game. And I know that when I get into the game, I can play really well. I have that potential, but beating yourself is not the way to do it. So yeah, with this loss, I was back on -1 with 2 rounds to go. The +3 score that was the GM norm score in this tournament was gone, and pretty tough way for it to happen. So anyways, thanks for watching. please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.